Years ago, I read about a food manufacturer that heard two eccentric old chemists working out of a cramped, half-equipped lab had cracked something the big companies couldn't. A genuinely excellent orange flavoring, not a passable one. The kind that's the difference between an average cake mix and one people actually remember. The company bought small batches at a steep price, watched sales of their orange cake mix climb and decided the obvious next move was to buy the whole operation. The deal took months. It was expensive. The paperwork was thick. The negotiations were long and everyone involved treated it as a well-run acquisition. Identify the problem, find the supplier, test the product, close the deal. On paper, nobody skipped a step. Then the company sent its own people into the lab to actually make the flavoring and found that none of the staff who came with the purchase actually knew how. The process was the old two-man secret, kept entirely in their heads. And by the time anyone figured that out, the two of them had already sold the exact same formula to a competitor for even more money and vanished to Mexico. That story gets told as a cautionary tale about trust or about doing better background checks on the people you buy from. I think that's a smaller lesson. The real one is about where the deal actually went wrong, and it wasn't in anything anyone said. Every decision like this rests on a pile of assumptions. And those assumptions come in two completely different shapes. Some are explicit, written down, said out loud, status as if they were fact. This flavoring tastes better than anything on the market was explicit. Somebody could have asked for the test data, and in this case, they apparently did. The sampling and the market verification happened. Explicit assumptions get scrutiny almost by accident because they show up as claims, and claims are the kind of thing a skeptical person in the room knows how to challenge. The assumption that actually sank the deal was never a claim at all. Nobody in that boardroom said, "We assume the manufacturing knowledge transfers automatically when we buy the company." Nobody wrote it in the deal memo. It wasn't a fact anyone stated and got wrong. It was the thing the entire acquisition silently depended on, and it was never examined because it never took the form of something you could disagree with. You can push back on a claim. You cannot push back on a silence. That's the distinction I want to spend this whole episode on, because I think it's one of the most underused ideas in how people make decisions. And it shows up everywhere, not just in corporate acquisitions from decades ago. Here's the mechanism as best I understand it. An explicit assumption looks like information. It arrives dressed as a fact, which means somebody's brain at some point registers it as a thing that could be checked, even if in practice nobody checks it. It's sitting there in the room, asking to be argued with. An implicit assumption doesn't arrive at all. It's not a sentence anyone says. It's the load-bearing wall nobody drew on the blueprint because everybody building the house assumed the others already knew it was there. Ask a room. Does this plan depend on the sales team already logged every customer interaction in a structured, usable format? And half the room will say, obviously. And the other half will realize in that exact second that they'd never actually checked. The gap between obviously and actually checked is where the expensive failures live. I think about this constantly with the work I do now, evaluating AI vendor pitches before someone signs. The explicit assumptions are almost the easy part. This cuts response time 40%, is a claim. You can ask where the number came from, and the vendor who can't answer that has told you something useful just by flinching. But the implicit ones are the ones that actually break the project 6 months in. That your support data is clean enough to train on, that the staff using the tool will actually adopt it instead of quietly working around it, that the vendor's roadmap survives contact with a compliance requirement nobody mentioned in the sales call. None of those get raised because none of them look like a pitch. They look like the ground everyone's standing on. I keep using acquisitions and vendor contracts as the examples because they are clean, but the same pattern runs through decisions that never touch a deal memo at all. You bring a contractor because the last one worked out and this one interviewed well. The explicit assumption is they can do the work. And you probably did check that. Portfolio, references, a test project. The implicit one is they will still be available and responsive 3 months in, once the honeymoon period ends and the work gets less interesting. Nobody puts that in a contract. It's just assumed, right up until it isn't true. Two people start a business together because they get along and complement each other's skills. Explicit: can they do the work? Do the numbers add up? Implicit: do they actually agree on what happens when the business is under real stress, not the version of each other we've seen so far? That second question almost never gets asked before the partnership starts, because asking it feels like inviting the conflict in early. It shows up anyway. It shows up later, more expensive and with more already invested. None of these decisions were badly reasoned. That's the pattern worth noticing. Every one of them had a clear, explicit case that held up. What they were missing wasn't rigor. It was the habit of asking what else has to be true for this to work, out loud, before committing. There's a trick for surfacing these before they cost you anything, and it's almost embarrassingly simple. Before you commit to a decision, instead of asking, "Will this work?" ask, "Imagine this failed badly. What happened?" That single reframe does something a straightforward risk discussion doesn't. Asking, "What could go wrong?" invites a list of known risks, the ones already sitting in someone's head as explicit worries. Asking people to actually picture the failure in some detail drags out things nobody had flagged as a risk at all, because it forces them to fill in a story, and stories need to be the long-bearing walls to make sense. In the orange flavoring case, 5 minutes of "imagine why we buy this company" and the flavor is never quite right again would have produced the obvious next question almost immediately. Wait, who actually knows how to make it? Once that question exists, it's an explicit assumption. Once it's explicit, someone can test it, negotiate around it, or structure the deal differently, the way the competitor eventually did by simply buying the recipe instead of the company. In practice, it takes about 10 minutes and one honest person willing to play along. Pick the decision, say the sentence out loud. "It's 18 months from now and this went badly wrong. What happened?" Then let people actually answer in scene, not in bullet points, not "risk adoption." But the team quietly went back to their old spreadsheets within 6 weeks because the new tool didn't handle the one exception case that comes up every single day. That level of detail is what turns a vague worry into something you can actually test before you sign, instead of after. The uncomfortable part of this exercise is that it only works if you're willing to sit with the answers you don't want. It's not a formality you run through to feel thorough. It's supposed to produce something specific enough that it changes what you do next. I've started building this directly into how I work because I got tired of watching smart people skip it under time pressure. If you paste an AI vendor proposal into the tool I put together, it doesn't just summarize it. It sorts the claims into two buckets. I've been describing this whole episode. The explicit ones stated as fact and worth checking, and the implicit ones, the things the entire plan quietly depends on that the document never mentions at all. Most people are surprised by the second list. Almost nobody is surprised by the first. That's not really a plug for a tool. It's the whole argument in one sentence. The explicit assumptions were never the dangerous ones. You were always going to notice those eventually because they announced themselves. It's the ones that never got written down that get you. What surprised me building it wasn't how good the tool got at spotting implicit assumptions. It's how bad I still am at spotting my own without it. I can read someone else's vendor proposal and find the load-bearing wall nobody drew in under a minute. Reading my own plans, I miss them constantly, for the same reason the acquiring company missed the one that actually mattered. When you are inside a decision, the things you're assuming feel like facts, not assumptions. Because you stop noticing you're assuming them at all. That's not a flaw you fix once. It's the reason this has to be a habit, not a one-time check. So here's what I'd actually ask you to do with this. And it's the same exercise every time, whatever the decision in front of you happens to be. Take whatever you're currently one signature away from committing to. A vendor contract, a hire, a partnership, a big purchase. Write down every claim in the pitch that states as fact. That's your explicit list, and it's useful, but it's not the dangerous one. Then do the harder part. Imagine it's gone wrong, badly, a year from now, and ask yourself what turned out not to be true that nobody had said out loud. Write down what surfaces. That list is almost always shorter than you'd expect, and almost always the one that would have actually saved you. Two old men in a lab knew exactly how valuable their silence was. Most of the assumptions that cost you won't be that deliberate. They'll just be the thing nobody thought to write down, because it never occurred to anyone that it needed saying. That's it for today's episode of Iconoclast Insights. Before you sign anything this week, try the premortem on it and pay attention to whatever surfaces that nobody actually said out loud. I'll see you in the next one.